All right, Leah's going to hand out some final handouts, and then we'll go ahead and get started. We've got a busy agenda tonight, so I'm going to probably try to keep us online as much as possible. So if I cut people short, it's not that I'm trying to be mean. It's just I want to keep us on schedule so we can get home and call this an evening. But we may go a few minutes extra, but we'll try to stay on task. So welcome to the last meeting, meeting 5 of the Oil and Gas Task Force. I really want to say I just really appreciate everybody's participation, the audience participation during this event. And hopefully, from this point forward, we can come together with some sort of a body of regulations and come out with something that everybody can say was worth working on. To get started, we got the first introduction part of the meeting. We're going to have a purpose of the meeting here tonight. We're going to talk a little bit about that. Leslie's going to do a quick presentation on that. Then we'll follow up with Megan Flanagan. She's from our Natural Resources Department. She's going to talk to us a little bit about oil and gas and how that impacts natural resources sites and some of their needs. And then with the study just coming out on health effects of oil and gas and whatnot, the Public Health Department's going to go ahead and give us a little bit of a discussion on what they think about what that said and how it impacts Larimer County. And then after that, we're going to move right into the normal agenda. We'll just cut right into the draft outline of regulations, and we'll talk about those and what everybody feels about them, and then we'll move towards the closing parts of our meeting tonight. So with that, I'm going to turn it over real quickly to Leslie Ellis, and she'll get us underway.
Good evening. So Leslie Ellis, I think you just covered most of the purpose of the meeting. So I'll just echo that, thank you for being here and all the hard work that you've done, and talk a little bit about, as we get into the outline of the regulations part of the meeting, we're hoping that this might be the last meeting of the task force. If you feel like we've got things mostly on track and that we can go away and do some more work and bring them back for you all and the public to look at some point in time. So on your agenda on the back side also are some options around the schedules, and we'll come to that toward the end of the meeting too. We'd like to get your feedback on where do we go from here after we have the conversation around some of the materials that you've seen and what you've been looking at, and get your input on that. I would remind you that where we are now, what you have before you isn't a complete set of regulations. We think of them more like an outline of what would become the regulations. So they may be, say, an 80% complete set of what the types of things that might go into the regulations. So really the purpose tonight, I think, is to look at those and let us know what's on track, what's missing, what's gone too far, what's not going far enough. I think we'd encourage you not to get into really detailed edits at this point, just because we've got more of that to come. And I think your time is going to be best spent on the bigger ideas and making sure that we're really approaching a process and the types of the standards correctly. So the first part of the meeting, as Matt said, is some of the background and to explain to you some of the new information related to health information that's been recently released, and then also some work that Natural Resources has been doing that may or may not dovetail into these regulations or might become part of our process as we go forward. So that's really what we're hoping to do tonight. We'd like to do a little bit of celebration at the end too. We've got some fun things for you at the end of the meeting, so we'll save some time for that as well. So with that, and then also you all have your boxed lunch, dinner. If you don't, grab one because we don't really have time for dinner built into the agenda. As I did the math again on here, I realized it doesn't add up to 3 hours. So feel free to eat when you're hungry. We may take a short break for dinner, but we probably won't take quite as long a break for dinner. We'll take a leg stretch break instead. So with that, let me turn it over to Megan then, who's next on the agenda.
Thank you. Let's see. Oh, okay, there we go. Thank you. So Leslie and Matt invited me to come just to share with you some of our conversations we've had as we've thought about how we would approach surface use agreements or surface use on our parks and open space properties and locally conserved lands, whether it's in fee or in conservation easements. And most of those lands as many of you might know, have been acquired through public investment of funds. So it's generally through our open space sales tax, whether it's a city or county property, partial donation from a landowner, through tax credit, the state tax credit program. Grant funds from Great Outdoors Colorado are invested in almost every property the county has acquired in fee or conservation easement. And so given that, we felt that it required, there was an expectation from the public of a certain level of protection of those lands, given that the intent to acquire them was really to conserve the natural, cultural, recreational resources on those properties. So with that, I just have a few slides to walk through and talk about how we've applied a process in the past called Energy by Design towards evaluating impacts to those properties. And the base premise, the goal is not to disallow access, but to provide reasonable access to mineral rights because we don't own them under most conserved properties. But to, at the same time, ensure that we're protecting the surface values. So whatever the natural or cultural, in some cases recreational resources might be on these properties. The starting premise that we're proposing is that we would look to have no surface use on those properties. So ideally to be able to access those minerals from off-site, unless there was no other reasonable or viable alternative. And we would go through a process asking the operator in partnership to review alternatives and look for other alternatives first. But if there was no other viable alternative, then we would have them go through a process that we employed up in the Laramie Foothills on Red Mountain Open Space and Soapstone Prairie back in 2013. And I wanted to share a little bit more about what that process would look like with you. On all of our properties, we have extensive biological resource inventories done. So we're the intact native vegetation communities, rare plants, habitat values. We have elk calving areas, raptor nests that we strive to protect with our planning. And so going through a mapping exercise to further identify those as needed, maybe update the information that we currently have. We would also look at the current recreational activities and what impacts might occur relative to those as far as view sheds, proximity to trails, trailheads, things like that. Then we would apply timing restrictions. So elk calving areas, there's timing restrictions where there's greater impact to those nesting periods for raptors. We would also look at buffers. So there's standard buffers for rare plants and plant communities, riparian areas to prevent impacts to those directly, whether it's weed incursions or sediment. Then the process is essentially a mapping exercise to overlay all the natural, cultural resources, those timing limitations, and come up with a zoning map showing different levels of areas from a preferred area that might be better suited for oil and gas development or surface impacts, down to areas that we would prefer there be no surface use. So just as an example, this is a map of Red Mountain Open Space and Soapstone Prairie. Wyoming state line is up here and I-25, as well as Meadow Springs Ranch out to the east. And this map was one of the first layers where we overlaid all the natural resources, nest sites, riparian zones. And from there, we then overlaid the cultural resource and several other layers to then really identify those zones again from a preferred use down to a no surface occupancy use area. And we ended up with a map that looked like this. So the dark blue areas being no surface use. For example, this area up at the north, if you're familiar with Soapstone Prairie, is where the Lindenmeyer site is. And it's a pretty large site, but then also having a quarter-mile buffer to that site to prevent impacts. A lot of the linear areas are riparian zones, wetlands. The Stippled circles are generally buffers to known elk calving areas, raptors, some rare plant communities. And then we also developed a series of best management practices. So based on the zoning area, if it was an area that did allow some amount of surface use or a preferred surface use, we then wanted to identify things such as disturbance caps. So at no point in time would there be more than so many acres impacted on the property or disturbed of vegetation. So certain levels of reclamation would have to happen concurrent with before future development could happen or future disturbance. We also put together compensatory mitigation, actual dollar amounts in that case. We were working with the state land board and identified a certain dollar amount per acre disturbed by zone. So if it was a zone that had higher conservation values or where we were looking to have less impact, we had a higher per acre cost that we would charge for that impact. We looked at timing limitations, the best management practices, talked a lot about road development, dust suppression, a lot of the other things you all are talking about throughout the regulations as well. So in short, this energy by design process is one that we haven't had to employ since the time that we did this plan, and there hasn't been any surface use proposed at these sites, but it's one that we felt worked well. It's one we'd like to continue to work through in the future if proposals do occur within boundaries of existing conserved lands, whether it's the city or county or others. And with that, I can take any questions or...
Yeah, what was the buffer that you used for the riparian areas?
We use 300 feet either side of the center line of the river.
I have a quick question. You said you haven't yet received any applications in any of these conservation areas yet?
Well, at Red Mountain Open Space and Soapstone, there was no
Okay.
formal application to drill.
Okay.
We have received, we own a farm south of Berthoud, and that was an area that we were approached to do some oil and gas development, but we were able to work with them to have it be a non-surface use, and in the end, they didn't exercise it.
Good.
Yeah.
This is a question for you as well as Leslie and Matt. Natural Resources has spent a lot of time developing this program, and I'm wondering how applicable this might be on a county-wide basis.
Do you want to take it, Matt, or do you want to?
So to apply these standards that she's talking about, I would hope that they apply, as I was understanding it, that we would try to find a way to apply them to all county-owned lands that are out there, but we'll have to study that and understand it. I think part of the question I would ask you guys after hearing what she had to say, what Megan had to say, is there any of these components that maybe should just really universally apply across the county, regardless of whether or not it's county land or not? And so as we go through tonight's discussions, maybe keep that into mind, how some of those standards might be built in and just apply universally to all projects. For instance, I wrote down while she was talking that wildlife buffers are big. You know, we got raptor nests all over the county, and we'd want to make sure that we time construction and other activities around when those nests are being used or occupied for specific purposes. And we can work and solve those problems and make sure those get integrated into the code. Then they apply everywhere, not just to natural resources land, so.
Matt, isn't it safe to say, I believe I'm correct in saying that the state already requires that the Parks and Wildlife are involved in a site survey or a aerial survey, an assessment before operations are commenced? Is that?
The
I
state
think that's
agencies
correct, yeah.
get notice on that and do this. And then I think what we're trying to do right now with our system, and as the local government designee, I get the notice coming into our department, and I'm working with the IT department to make it that when I receive a notice, that I automatically notices other departments within the agency so that they have an opportunity to provide me feedback without us losing that opportunity to comment. So, yeah, there'll be plenty of opportunity. I think as we look forward later tonight into some of the types of things that get submitted, a wildlife plan will be part of the application submittals on most of these applications anyway. So at that point, we'll get to study what's happening next to all oil and gas facilities if they're proposed in Larimer County. Doug?
Matt, I think this process represents an important option that the county should consider, in that it's not just based on a standard. So for instance, a setback standard. It's based on going in and doing an inventory and finding what kind of resources you value, and then trying to the maximum extent possible, avoid those resources. And I can see that even on a privately owned piece of property, there may be, it's different than just saying, we think you ought to be 100 or 500 feet away from a dwelling. There may be better places on that property, given directional drilling, that can avoid drainage areas, wetlands, wildlife habitat, those kinds of things.
Exactly.
That ends up being a win-win. And it's hard to write that in the standards without saying, these are the things we value and the things we'd
Right.
like to see you inventory.
Correct. Mhm. And whether that gets actually written into a regulation or if that becomes a criteria or a requirement of a plan is a different question. So in the regulations, for instance, and I'm just gonna use this as an example, the first item under the application requirements is a site inventory map. And not everybody knows what goes into a site inventory map, but in the county historically, that's been to do things like identify what wildlife resources are within a distance of the property, what tree stands, what water resources, what roads, and inventory all these natural and man-made features, and then from that point, build your application around those resources and make sure that we protect them in a reasonable manner. So hopefully we can continue with that conversation a little bit later.
I don't know who this question is for, but a situation that arose near my home is that the property is owned privately and it's not marked as CPW sensitive area, even though it technically would be if they evaluated it. So I don't know how that works. Are they exempt from having wildlife protections that they need to do because it's private property? Do you understand what I'm saying?
The answer is no.
No.
Okay. So
I
they
don't-
would still have to go through a CPW evaluation?
Yes.
Okay.
I think CPW just identifies critical habitat that they know of out there, that they can put something around it. But if there's unknown, because they don't get to study every area because they don't get to go on people's private property. Similarly, Larimer County has wetland regulations that say you buffer wetlands, and we have wetland mapping. That mapping was done via aerial analysis and some drive-by surveys, but we never got the opportunity to go on property and survey their land to determine the edges of the wetlands. And so it's just an indicator to us, and if there is a wetland we think in the area, then we ask them to do a wetland report and mitigation plan.
So who's required to do the survey then? Does CPW still come in and survey the land prior to drilling?
No, the applicant.
No, the applicant
provides
does,
the
okay.
analysis from a professional, yeah. Welcome, Richard.
Are the proposed reclamation standards that we were sent, is that for county-owned lands only, or what do those apply to?
Yeah, we're proposing that they could be countywide. So general, both to conserve lands, but there might be even a higher standard on conserved lands relative to, the impact that we might have mapped, but generally countywide.
Because the state requires a reclamation plan as part of most of their applications, if I understand that correctly,
It does, the regulations are
at each phase of the development.
correct.
And so we can look at those and see if those reclamation standards that are typically submitted with the state are adequate for the county stuff. And if not, through a referral process, I receive an application, I route it to our natural resources folks. They may say, we need you to supplement that with some additional information.
Right. There's quite a bit, and if you just look generally at the Series 1000 rules, there's pieces in there that aren't typically, they're not stated, but there's much more beneath the surface, and there's much more that the actual reclamation inspectors in that department of the COGCC look for. And so I think just based off of some of the inspections that they've done and corrective actions that they typically give to operators, that will tell you some of the things that they already are regulating.
Other conversations, questions? Yes?
Just out of curiosity, within any of the lands that you've identified, does the county own the service and not the mineral estate in those regards? And then what are kind of the standard conservation easement type applications? I'm going to assume that oil and gas drilling was addressed in those conservation easements, and I'm just curious what those standard agreements look like.
Yeah. So on all fee-owned county properties, we own the surface. We don't necessarily own the minerals. In most cases, we don't. And then with conservation easements, they're still privately, the surface rights are still privately held. We just hold conservation easement around conservation values that are identified in that document. So it may limit development's right to subdivide. It calls out specific conservation values, whether it's native shortgrass prairie, a riparian area. Why is it that we conserved it, and what are those natural values we conserved? In some of our old easements, we've held conservation easements since 1999 in our department, and some of the other ones held by Land Trust, the Nature Conservancy, even predate that. So some of those earlier ones weren't, oil and gas development wasn't contemplated as much. Our current ones, we do contemplate it further, and we talk about being at the table and working with those landowners to ensure the conservation values identified in the easement are protected through whatever surface activity might happen. So it doesn't preclude their ability to extract minerals, just how they're going to do that to protect the conservation values.
Well, good. I hope that we can keep this going and we'll leave stuff up on the screen. We don't need the screen for anything else tonight. We'll keep this in mind as we go through the conversation, as we start to delve into the draft regulations, and if there's ways to strengthen things or do something, we can. So keep what was just discussed in mind as we go forward tonight. So as you're all aware that earlier, well, it's been about a week or two now, there was a study that came out about the health effects associated with oil and gas, and that study's passed through a lot of groups and whatnot. And everybody's interpreted it in their own way, which is pretty normal for a lot of these things. And so Thomas Butts from the Health Department is going to share some of the thoughts that our county health department has about those findings, and share his thoughts with us. And then we will have a brief conversation before moving on to the rest of tonight's agenda. Thomas?
Thanks, Matt. I wanted to let all of you know we passed out 3 different items to help sort of provide some framework for this discussion. The 3 items are a release from the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission identifying their 3 action steps that they are taking based on this study. And we can walk through that one first, probably. Essentially what they did, the study, so let me step back and give you a little bit of framework for the study. So this study was a risk analysis of existing data that had been collected more or less between 2014 and 2016. So it was not a data collection exercise, it was a data analysis risk assessment kind of exercise. The data collected between 2014 and 2016 was from Garfield County and the Front Range. A lot of the drilling data, for example, was only in Garfield County. So there are some differences in oil and gas in Garfield County and oil and gas in the Front Range that will have to be parsed and sorted out and understood. The other thing, a couple of items of notes, I guess, is that the health risk assessment was based on a near worst case scenario. So the highest measurements were used to do the risk analysis part of the evaluation. What's not clear is if those are representative or not representative of the kind of conditions we see around these sites all the time. And that's one of the major focuses of the follow-on work that will be done by both OGCC and the folks setting new air quality regulations. The good news, I guess, is that although there were some short-term negative health impacts identified potentially, they did not identify any long-term chronic or cancer-based negative impacts. So obviously there'll be more data collected that will fall into evaluate both of those kind of categories in the future, but it gives us a little more clarity now. One of the caveats that we've had lots of discussion about is that the regulations and the oversight, for example, the LDAR inspections that are occurring now were not in place when some of that 2014 data was collected. So there's a lot more oversight of our sites now than there was when the data was collected. Hopefully that means things are safer. Does that mean we don't take the study into account? No, it's still an important piece of data to gather with other data to help us try and make reasonable decisions. Let's see. I think one of the, so let me jump to the OGCC press release. It's the two-pager with the staple in the upper left. The three actions that they've identified that they are going to take on their side of the permit review process is to really look more carefully at all applications where the nearest receptor is less than 2,000 feet. So that means they will be using those objective criteria that the director identified a number of months ago after 181 was passed. And they will be scrutinizing that and engaging with health folks and others to try and carefully evaluate that and gather more data about the processes going on at those sites. The next one is to really dig in and gather more data. I think that you'll hear that theme probably from me several times in the next few minutes. And it's not like we ever feel like we have enough data in epidemiology, but we do feel like we've moved the bar some. We need to move it a little further before we can really set hard limits and come up with sort of foundational changes. But OGCC and the State Health Department are both committed to digging for that data and getting that data and bringing that data to force, whether that's in terms of OGCC regs or air quality regs or both. So I think that's good news for all of us. We have folks that will gather better data, will help us understand the situation currently, and will be able to help then apply those in a reasonable way. And then they're committed to having this data as an active part of their 181 regulation revision discussions, which I don't know how you would exclude that, but seems like a reasonable thing to do. I do not know much more about the OGCC side of the house, and I don't know if other folks have additional information they've heard, but I know that their regulation setting processes driven by 181 are active, engaged, across the board. From the state health perspective, there's both a one-page sort of press release summary and then a two-column item that I find sort of helpful, which is sort of what this is and what this isn't, what the study helps us put a little bit more clarity around and where we really have additional questions that will have to be contemplated with additional data or additional analysis or other information that's gathered. It's good information. It's been peer reviewed. Is it completely up to date with all the technologies and all the things we're doing right now? No, it's not. So it gives us a snapshot in time. It is also, as I mentioned, the risk assessment itself is based on worst case scenarios, which means higher exposure than we think is likely on a day-to-day basis, but we don't know because it's really difficult to sample continuously from source to downwind location for the duration of a drilling operation that's multiple days or a fracturing operation or a flowback operation. The other thing that it helped us do is it did help us focus that where we need to be looking is at that development process, those first 90 days of operation, if you will. So they did not find anything once a pad goes into the sort of operational phase and is producing that would be of concern, which I think that's really good news. So I think those are the sites that are actually in many cases closer to our developments as those developments have encroached on older oil and gas activities. I think the other thing, new regulations will certainly focus on those first 90 days, the drilling, the fracturing, and the flowback phases. And the flowback, I think, was potentially identified as the highest source. So what technologies can be implemented? That's probably beyond our scope at the local level, but that's certainly in OGCC's and the air quality's wheelhouse to say, during flowback, what can be done? I think flowback has changed a lot in the past 15 years. We used to have ponds. We used to have just lined pits. None of that stuff exists in the Front Range anymore. So we've made lots of changes, we meaning the environmental regulations around oil and gas. There's still, I think, additional opportunities and additional technologies that will have to be looked at to see if that can be done even better. I think the state is also committed, the State Health Department and Air Quality Control Commission is committed to using this data in their regulation setting processes. So again, it's not perfect, but it will be used. It is important piece of the puzzle as they refine their air regs. And so it's great to see that commitment to do that. With that, I guess I will attempt to answer any questions you might have. I mean, I've looked at the study. It's a lot of data and analysis and assumptions and calculations, but I'm happy to try and give you a sort of layman's interpretation of what I know of it so far. Yes, Doug.
In terms of moving forward on the Colorado Oil and Gas Commission's point number 2, which is about the data that you talked about.
Right.
You indicated that the initial study just looked at existing data. For this next phase, since it's 2019 and we're in modern control area and stuff like that, are they going to be collecting new data? Is potentially sampling in the field going to be included in that?
Yes, I absolutely believe that's the case. And I think they're going to try and use, I mean, no, Broomfield is collecting a pile of data on the operations in their jurisdiction right now. I know Adams County is going to be collecting data. The state's CAMEL, which is their mobile analyzer, is actively in use and in play. So there will be more data collected. And I know Garfield County has collected data over the last year that was not included in this study. And when they looked at the risk calculations, they found one point on one of their sampling events that raised the same kind of issue. And they were sampling at about 350 feet downwind. Okay. So as that data gets pulled in, and the smart folks at the State Health Department, the toxicologists and risk assessors and the folks they hire to evaluate that data, I think we'll get a clearer and clearer picture. Yes, Mary?
This is probably more for the county health department than the study specifically, but is the county health department going to come out with a recommendation as far as the setback, like Tri-County did with Adams?
We are not. I think that it's certainly a key part of the conversation tonight, but it's not, I don't feel it's our role to say this is yes or no, a safe distance. There's lots of factors that have to be considered there. It's not an area that we were specifically tasked with, and it's not a position we have staked out.
Okay, so more deferring to the state?
Yeah, I think you will see, based on this and the additional data they collect, that that's going to be carefully evaluated. And I think that, again, not trying to get a cart in front of a horse, let them, the folks with the more high-paid scientists, make a good, take a position on that before we do.
Tom, just a quick question.
Sure.
The note from COGCC calls out 2,000 feet, and I don't know if you have any idea of why 2,000. Was there something in the study that jumped out and said,
So the study evaluated receptors between 500 and 2,000 feet. So that was the extent of the study. And those short-term acute effects were identified at each distance, potential, I should say. Again, this is all modeled, not measured. So the study showed a difference between those distances, but still showed a potential acute effect at 2,000 feet. Again, short-term things like headache and impacts from odors. I think as we look at how do we regulate this, from my perspective, we've talked a lot about if operations can be done in a way that odors don't impact neighbors, then much of this is also taken care of.
So, Tom,
Yes.
just because I want to be clear on it, the 2,000 feet that was identified in the study and that's mentioned in this COGCC's release is not a number by which there will be setbacks. It's just a number by which they will
be
apply
screening.
the director's objective
Correct.
criteria and make a stronger analysis on a bigger area.
Right.
And make their judgment on that. The COGCC setbacks for oil and gas operations are still the same.
Right.
At 500 feet with a 1,000-foot buffer, I mean, if you go inside the 1,000-foot buffer, you got to do certain things.
Yeah, I mean, the science around that is not settled.
Has the county discussed doing emission testing?
I don't think
Or
we
is that
have.
more regulation related?
So we oversee air pollution emission sources, just like the state. We do some of the same work that the state does. But we have not contemplated additional emission testing. I don't think that was sort of in our charge to look at, but can always be revisited.
It's open for discussion, but I keep in mind that whenever you require testing or information, then you're going to have staffing levels to gather that data, to analyze the data, to do something with it. What happens if that data turns over some leaf? How do you enforce that information? And so I think that we've tried to keep it within the box that we believe, and this is what I understand from the advice that we get from our health department, we believe that the state health department's doing an adequate job on a lot of that, and that other agencies that will be doing some of the testing will pick up on that data anyways. And then we can just use it as reference material and whatnot.
Yeah.
You know.
I think the other part of it is that leak detection and repair program the state has initiated. I mean, we believe that's a really important part of what should be done. And I think it's, again, something we want to talk about tonight. Should Larimer County receive those reports as well? Should they be more frequently done? Certainly the semi-annual reporting to the state they've moved the bar over the past few years to that increased frequency, and they've seen reductions from 28% issue rates to down to 10 or 12%. So I think that's shown value. I think that could be an area of additional focus that we would expect operators to have. Yes, Ann?
Yes, so you mentioned that the period of study was from exploration to flowback?
No, they looked at the whole thing, but the focus where they identified potential short-term acute risks was the drilling to flowback.
And what time period is that?
Do you mean duration? It's quite variable. I believe an average for a single well, it's about a week to drill one. Is that right for folks around the table from industry? And then the hydrofracturing can take longer than that, and the flowback is somewhat formation dependent, but can go up to, I think there was one case where it went up to 30 days, and that was in Garfield County, not in the Front Range.
The study did also address the after flowback effects.
Right. So if you've got an ongoing well pad that's operating with all the control measures and things on it, yeah, that did not show issues of concern. Yes.
Do you know if, did this study look at anything besides cancers that are known to be potentially caused by things like benzenes or those BTEX compounds? Did they look at other cancers, other health risks, long-term things? I think we had mentioned the congenital heart defects last time. Did
Yeah,
they pull that in? And
I am not sure
Yeah.
about that nuance. I know sort of the general theme was acute, not chronic things that, like headaches and nosebleeds and skin rashes and those kind of things. And then cancers, obviously. But there are certainly lots of other adverse health outcomes that we study all the time. And I don't know to what extent they did that. And again, there's a limitation that we didn't sample for every chemical under the sun. They sampled for a set of chemicals. And those are usually, by the nature of the way toxicology works, you look at sort of the worst actors like benzene, because we know it causes cancer. And so if you get that to a safe level, then you've gotten usually your other things to a safer level. So, but yeah, that's identified as an area of potential future analysis and review.
One or maybe two more questions, and we gotta move forward.
I think we could all take some comfort in the study in that it took data from 3 to 5 years ago when green completions were not employed to the extent they are now. And it took the worst levels of those measured concentrations and put them under a worst-case weather scenario in which the wind direction was directed from the source to the receptor, to a person standing outside of a house, essentially, for a long period of time. And from those worst-case scenarios, they didn't measure any long-term effects. And I'm really not surprised there were some short-term effects because it's a pretty extreme case. But I think we can take some comfort in that with old data showing high levels of emissions in a worst-case direct point-to-point weather condition, there were not worse effects than these.
One more.
Andy, I have a question for you on that. So I don't know this, are green completions required now?
They are. On the Front Range, it's mandatory. It's the only way it's done.
Yeah, and it's my understanding that the state health department is going to strongly encourage those sort of statewide via the air regs. And a green completion, does everybody know what a green completion is? It's as much of a closed loop completion as possible, is that right? Where things aren't vented, things are captured and contained.
So flowback comes into a tank. The
Or series of
then
tanks.
drained via another tank equipment, and it's hauled off and treated in different ways.
Once hydrocarbons show up, then the flow is directed to a closed system, to a separator. And the gas is burned or put down a pipeline, and the oil is contained in a sealed tank, as with the water. And the VOCs from those tanks are then combusted. They're hooked up to a combustor. So once hydrocarbons show up, then it's directed
Lots of
to a
those
sealed
controls come
system.
into place. Okay, thanks.
All right.
It's-
Last
It's
one,
for
Mary.
Angela. What is Weld County doing with this info? What are they doing with emissions testing and with the study?
Currently, they defer to the state.
All right. Okay, well then, moving right along, go get your dinner, you already got it. So we've kind of caught ourselves up, we're within about 10 minutes of where we ought to be. I'll just take a really brief moment and I'll have you look at, I printed out the draft regs that we sent out to you before. If you have copies of your own, that's great. If not, I printed out a supplemental copy. Just to give you an outline of typically how we draft regulations in Larimer County, how our code is structured. We set this up that the front end of the document identifies, of course, a purpose and intent, and is backed by where did we get the authority to do this work, and where is it going to be applicable in Larimer County. And then, of course, there's a severability clause that makes sure that we're covered by those things. Section 17.2 really covers what is going to be the required process for evaluating these types of things. So as we discussed at the last meeting, we set up, if you recall, I had a whole bunch of criteria on setbacks. If you were a certain distance from an oil and gas facility, then you'd go through a special review. If you weren't, then it was potential that you could do an administrative process. And we mapped that out, and we have a map here to share if you guys want to look at it. But really, the intent there was to get us slotted into a process based on setbacks. But in looking at the total scheme of Larimer County, and I went back and looked a little bit, right now, there are 5 surface applications that are applied for in Larimer County. And those 5 were submitted either prior to Senate Bill 181 or even as far back as this time last year. And so they're not new applications that are coming forward. We've seen a really strong downturn in the number of applications. And history has made it be, Larimer County's only received between 3 and 5 surface applications a year. We receive a lot of applications, but those are downhole applications that occur along with the surface applications. And so, based upon the number of applications we're getting and probably will stay on that trend in the long run, it was decided that rather than trying to create some complicated system around administrative or non-administrative processes, that right now what Larimer County would suggest is all oil and gas operations goes through our special review process. We just do it, we go through it. If 2 years from now we find out that that process is too onerous on some application types, then we can always come back and amend it and create an amended administrative procedure for those types of applications. But for right now, until we understand how it's going to operate in Larimer County, our current suggestion under 17.2 is that everything go through a special review process. The second question there, which I've highlighted on the pages, is should we as the county operate concurrently with the state approvals, post approvals to the state, or prior to the state approvals? So we can have a conversation tonight around that a little bit and understand the pros and cons of each one of those. They're there. In addition to having just a special review process, there are other permits that are required in the land use code, such as access permits, building permits. We're moving towards doing electrical permits in Larimer County, so any electrical permits and stuff like that will be required for these types of uses. And of course, if there's construction of roads and things like that, there'll be a development construction permit with our engineering department to make sure that that they meet those requirements of our engineering staff. 17.3 is the heart of the code. That's where, okay, if you're going to submit an application, these are the types of standards that we expect that you're going to comply with, or that you're going to demonstrate you can comply with, and you should implement as part of your operating procedures. And if you can't, then of course in your application process you would have to file appeals to those standards and then provide explanation to the staff and ultimately the Board of County Commissioners as to why those standards should be deviated from, or is there some better practice to implement on that. So that's 17.3, and I believe that we'll spend a great deal of our time there tonight. 17.4 is guidelines, and so some things that maybe there's some opportunity to suggest to the oil and gas industry that hey, you know, you might want to incorporate some of these bigger and better practices into your applications, and if so, here's some possible suggestions on that. And then 17.5 is where our application requirements resonate. And currently, I brought some handouts. Currently, we have a special review process in Larimer County, and it requires things like a wetland mitigation report or a wildlife report and analysis and mitigation plan. And so we already require a lot of those plans. So rather than replicate them inside of this document, I just made reference that those things that are assigned to our land use code will be required. And in addition to that, those items that are listed in here, we may require as part of future applications for oil and gas operations. And then the last 4 or 5 sections that you'll find in there are how to file appeals, how enforcement occurs. That's okay. That's all right. We don't need it. impact fees, those types of things. And if we need to talk about those tonight, we can, but those tend to be more just operational things at the county level and how we deal with business. So with that, what I'm going to do, I've sent this out. You guys have had a chance to look at it, drive some of your own comments, make some suggestions. I think that we can just delve right in. If there's, we can start with section 17.1, and if anybody wants to offer any discussion about whether or not we're on the right track with this stuff, or if we're way off base. What I think we don't want to get down into is a bunch of wordsmithing of this tonight. We can always come back and wordsmith it at a later date, but if there's something that's really bad content, let us know and we'll work on that. So I'll open up the floor to you guys' discussion. 17.1.
I think an earlier version of the intent statement had a clause about the rights of the mineral owner.
It might have. I
Okay,
don't recall.
I don't see that in here.
Okay. In order to protect the rights of the mineral interest owner?
Correct.
Yeah, we had discussed that. I don't think it was in our original draft, but I know that Adams County had addressed that, and we had talked about that the last time, just pointing out that we recognize the validity of those property rights. I would like to see as well.
Okay.
The other comment that I had, in the last sentence, we talk about minimizing the negative impact on environment, wildlife, and residents of the county.
Mhm.
I would just like to see the residents put first in that order.
Okay.
Not to wordsmith you.
That's fine.
Yep, in addition to protecting the right of the owners of the mineral estate, even protecting the right of the owners of the surface estate too, that are being impacted by the operation. Just to recognize that they enter into a surface use agreement and they may have specific desires for their property as well.
You want to expand on that?
Let's say that a surface owner wants the location to be in a certain area. That's negotiated with this owner of the surface estate to get to the minerals. And sometimes that is part of the rationale for the COGC permit process. And I just wanted the right to be recognized that the owner of the surface estate has a part in where the facility will be located.
To give some perspective and context on that, kind of as a general statement of law, when you're looking at the mineral rights and the surface rights, the mineral rights are treated as the dominant estate, which mean, and the surface rights are treated as a serving estate, which means there's an applied easement to be able to produce the minerals. But I would agree that I'd like to see some additional protections for surface owners so that there's not carte blanche for access to the surface for operators. There's some kind of protections in place. I know the COGCC rules require notice and a consultation. I'd like to see some additional protections probably beyond that, something where operators have to take best steps to try and minimize impact to the surface for surface owners. If there's a non-consenting surface owner, ideally, I'd like to see a requirement, a general requirement, that operators negotiate surface use agreements, and that part of their process is that they have to go out and try and identify surface use areas where the owners consent to the development. And in situations where they can't show that, or they can't do that, they have to be able to show what they've done and the steps they've taken before they can compel surface owners into using that property for development.
So something that's not built into here that I think initially I started to contemplate as I read through 181 was 181 now allows local jurisdictions to do much like on an EIS or a 1041 application, to say to the oil and gas industry, you need to provide an analysis in your pooling area as to where it might be best for the site to be located for the actual drilling operation. Is that something that you think that we ought to be doing, or should, I mean, because that's a separate process. That would be to say, do this kind of an analysis like Megan was showing, where are all the different resources and things that are happening in a large area, 80 acre or 100 acre, couple thousand acre area, and show us 3 different sites where you could locate and create your drilling opportunities to capture your resource. And then there will be some sort of scrutiny of that application to determine which one of those sites the producer ought to go look at.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one way to do it, but that puts a lot of decision, that puts another process into the county's jurisdiction, let's say, or the local government's jurisdiction to say, you know, we're gonna start picking and choosing how you pick your sites versus give us the best available site and we'll evaluate that.
And I think that kind of goes along the line with what I'm trying to envision and what I'm thinking about in terms of surface use, is that if you have a requirement that they show 3 or 4 different sites, what were the negotiations they had with surface owners at each of those sites? Is there a site where there's a consenting surface owner who's open to a surface use agreement and is willing to allow them, versus surface owners who do not want it there but will end up being forced into having it because the mineral estate's the dominant state? And part of the criteria is, if you have reasonable alternatives, and one of those reasonable alternatives is a surface owner that's willing to allow the development, I think that has to favor.
Do we stop with the surface owner, or do we look at other things like environmental conditions and all those things? And if so, that in itself is I'm just gonna play this out for a second. If I'm the industry person, before I can even start figuring out how I'm gonna attack the problem, I've gotta go out and do this evaluation of multiple sites, set up all the pros and cons analysis, do all that kind of stuff. And then I need to come through some process to get that decision made, because I don't want to spend money doing a wetlands analysis and a wildlife analysis and a mitigation plan and all these things for a site that I don't know that I'm guaranteed to have that site for. So I just open it up that that's a lot of work. And
That's an important point, what you just said, in that that work is done before the operator prepares the permit application and gets the surface use agreement.
Right.
And I think it would be fair for the process to inquire of the operator, where else did you look?
Right.
But I don't think the county wants to get into, show us 3 fully developed sites and we'll pick.
No.
There's
But
just
maybe
too much
3 sites that have analyzed, that have given us enough information to say, this is probably the best site that you should be looking at, and then they go function towards it.
I don't agree with the idea that the county gets to pick.
Okay.
Because there's, as you said, there's a lot of effort that goes into all the studies. And in that case, the operator would have to get a surface use agreement with 3 separate landowners and go through the permit application process, preparing all the steps for 3 separate sites.
Right.
When, in general, one site becomes the clear favorite early on. And so I think the process is already long enough and involved enough that to allow the county to pick from 3 fully developed applications is duplicative and
So absent the
excessive.
county picking it, which I agree with you, and then I want to hear from some other people. If the county isn't picking the site, or if there isn't some selection process, then is there a process to analyze them? Because then the industry's going to come in and say, here's my analysis of 3 sites, this is the one we chose, and that's one we're going with. And that's really would be
Right.
to say then, okay, well.
What's wrong with that?
Because if we go the other way, then if we got too far down the rabbit hole, then somebody could be saying, well, we don't like this site, why didn't you pick one of your other sites? And
But if
you
I
know,
bring
open
you a
that door
site
up.
that meets all the criteria and has a willing surface owner and a surface use agreement, which is one of their requirements, why
like the
should
idea of
why
a
should I
surface
have to
agreement
show you 3 of those?
requirement, yeah.
Yeah, Matt, I would agree with Andy. I think you need to stay out of that negotiation.
I have a,
The conversation started with, what do you do when you have a surface rights owner who doesn't want anything done where they have surface rights? And now we've gotten into any application.
That case happens rarely.
Yeah.
Very rarely.
But, and I
Yeah.
think, I mean, it might be worth discussing that,
And-
but
and I
let's
think-
not peanut butter it into having the county making decisions about what lucky landowner gets to have that on their property.
Isn't this a discussion that if we're going to do a special review, isn't this something that should be identified or part of the special review process, specifically a pre-application conference where the applicant meets with the staff? And if the staff thinks it's advisable and there is enough public interest, then the applicant, as part of that process, prior to the application being filed, meets with the public who are engaged in the process. Then you can file the application knowing where what direction you're going for, and you don't have to worry about whether the county is picking a site for you. You know what input you're going to get from the county, you know what the county's expectations are, you know what the public's concerns are, and you know how to address them, and now you can present the application through this special review process. Couldn't
That's
that
correct.
solve your problem?
The special review process, if we go that route, vets all of that.
The one thing I just want to, and I think you probably understand all this, but there's three different parties, right? There's the surface use owner, the mineral, well, there could be potentially even more people, because it's not always the mineral estate owner that's the operator. It could be somebody else entirely, and then the operator's just there. So my point is just the surface use agreement, the county, that's a legally negotiated agreement between the surface user and the operator. That's not a negotiation that the county is a party to. And so we have an ability to be in the process, I guess, but I just want to make it clear, that's the two parties on the surface use agreement. I don't think the county wants to be in the middle of that.
Frank, I think that the county has the authority to ask that the surface agreement not be finalized until the applicant has completed the special review process. And I think that Boulder County specifically is doing that.
I'm just saying that agreement, when the names are signed on the bottom of that agreement, it'll be the surface owner and the operator. It won't be the county that's a signatory to that.
And I guess part of this, I know I'm jumping ahead, but since we're kind of talking about it at this point, part of 17.5 application requirements is that applications for oil and gas facilities shall include, when relevant, the following, and one of those items is a surface use agreement. So I guess my question is, in interpreting that, is that statement, when relevant, meaning included if there is a surface use agreement, or are they required to have a surface use agreement and show it's in place as part of the application?
Matt can answer this. I think, all right, the sort of format that we were going for was you've got standards, which would be required for everybody. In other words, if you don't meet the standard, you do not move forward. Then there are guidelines, which are, this is what we would suggest that you do, and we want you to do these things, and then we'll take account of the overall application. I think if you wanted to say you must provide a surface use agreement or something like that, then you could do that. One thing I'll comment on that too is the operators a lot of times don't want to provide the surface use agreement because it has information in it that they view as confidential.
Yep.
And so an alternative is that you just have to demonstrate that have some agreement in place with the surface user
Yeah.
or the surface owner.
Yeah, you can put together a separate memoranda showing that
Right.
it exists without the specific terms and compensation. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
So operators are already held to the reasonable accommodation doctrine, which requires them to reasonably accommodate the service owner. But it being a long-established part of the law is that mineral estate is the dominant estate. And if we start saying you have to have a surface use agreement and that service owner's not able or not willing to provide a surface use agreement for this application, then you kind of take away that dominant estate for the mineral owner. So what would we do in the situation where we have a dominant estate mineral owner separate from the surface owner? We're requiring a surface use agreement that the surface owner won't grant. I mean, the law upholds that the dominant estate owner still gets to produce their property, right?
Julie, I don't think it's a matter of the county trying to enforce something. It's a matter of the county trying to make sure that we have a process that can move forward without the county getting involved in litigation in between the surface and the mineral estate. So if the county just says, demonstrate for us that you've worked out the legal nuts and bolts, then we can move forward. But if you haven't, if you have a situation where the mineral estate is moving forward in spite of what's going on with the surface agreement, how's the county supposed to do other standards under 181 if that can't even be determined?
All right. Well, I think this is something that we're certainly going to have to study with the future of this. I think we got the idea that we got to study that a little bit more, and we'll move on that. To keep the meeting going, make sure we cover all the ground that we need to cover tonight. We're going to kind of go through this real quickly, and we're going to ask a couple series of questions. And so each section we're going to ask you to give us an idea, thumbs up idea. Is that section strong enough? Is it good? Is that what you want to see? So thumbs up will be, we like that section. Thumb to the side might be that, okay, I can live with it. It needs a little bit of work, but I can live with it. And thumbs down, I really am just not with that section. And then we'll take a quick pulse of the table and we'll go around and everybody will get a chance to say what they do or don't like about that section. Leslie's taking notes so we can capture all that and get that back into the system. And I think that will keep us going fast enough tonight so that we can get through all of this information. Because just like any conversation, we tend to go down rabbit holes. So, thanks again. Section 17.1, we just started to delve into it. There was some good comment on that. I just really quickly, after reading that, is there anybody here? Let's just do a real quick pulse check. Thumbs up, thumbs to the side, or thumbs down. Let's start with thumbs up. Who thinks that that's appropriately worded and going in the right direction? Huh?
It's going in the right direction, but is the wording yes?
You're going to be up.
Well, no.
I like it. You're going in the right direction. I like you going in the right direction, and then there's some work that needs to be done. I can tolerate it. And then, no, I think we're going the wrong direction. Okay? You good with that, Ann? You bet. All right, let's go through it again. So those who think that the section 17.1 intent and purpose and applicability is moving in the right direction. Thumbs up. Let's start with just thumbs up. Those with thumbs up, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay? Those that think that it's something they can tolerate but might need a little bit of work. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah. Uh-huh. And those who think that it's just not tolerable. Okay. Real quickly, we're going to go around. We're going to spend just a couple of minutes on this. We'll start on the left-hand side here. Andy, is there something you want to share about that? Do you think it can be, that can improve it?
Specifically in 17.1?
Yes, sir.
I would like to, what I said before, recognize the fact that there are multiple stakeholders, including a mineral owner.
Okay. Okay.
Generally, that would be my comment as well, also adding stakeholder and language about protection of the surface owner as well.
Okay. Okay.
More definition as to what all other nuisance type effects are and what is considered adverse.
Okay. Richard?
You don't have to say anything.
Don't have to say anything? Okay. Doug, anything else?
No, I'm satisfied based on the conversation we've had.
Okay. Mary?
The only thing I'd add is under number 4, I would add quantity to water. water quality, quantity, and source.
Okay, Ann? Okay, Adrian? Okay, that's fine. Sure.
I'd like to strengthen the language a little bit and remove to the extent practicable in section A. I don't think it's necessary. I'd like to remove in B5 as appropriate. I think that's obvious. And in 6, I think it's a little vague and unenforceable.
Okay. When? Okay. Kristen?
Sorry. As was said earlier, in addition to a couple of other comments that have been made, just putting the residents before the environment and the wildlife.
I just want to point out that under B, those 6 regulations are taken straight out of Senate Bill 181 as
Yep.
they're worded. I thought that nuisance one was pretty vague myself, but it's straight out of the act. In terms of subset C, it says activity commenced on any property in Larimer County. I was just curious if we would recognize the applicability to state and federal lands within the county. Because the way it looks, it applies to state and federal. Is that the intent?
I think it was more related to zoning, that we didn't have any zoning districts, like we were gonna put it all in industrial, whatever. So maybe we can clarify it into zoning.
Yeah, also municipality, Kristen brought up.
And we
If
don't,
it would fall under like Fort Collins,
right.
like
Yeah,
the
we
regs
don't
they're
work inside the
developing.
incorporated areas of the cities.
Okay.
Yeah, so we'll clarify that. Thank you. Angela?
Yes. I also agreed about the adding the mineral owners and the service owner information and the putting the residents first. But I had no further comments on 17.1.
All right. Very good. Moving right along, 17.2 is about process and permits, and probably 17.2A is the biggest part of that, which is, does everybody comfortable with the fact that we go through a special review process at this point, or should there be alternate processes? So is 17.2 written to a point that is satisfactory to everybody at the table?
Short answer, no.
We're gonna do a thumbs up.
Okay, excuse me.
All right, thumbs up, same thing. Thumbs up, you like it. Thumb to the side, it needs some work, but you could tolerate it. Thumbs down, it's just not tolerable. All right, everybody, thumbs up. Let's do
17.2.
17.2, the whole thing.
B and C.
Let's do the whole section.
I mean, it may be good, the gist of 17.2 is just saying you have to get a special review.
That's the most
That's
of it.
pretty much what it is.
The rest of the permits are pretty much mandatory.
Are we also voting on your highlighted question?
No, but we might have a discussion about it in a little bit. Everybody ready? Thumbs up. Those in favor of special review process? 2, okay. And those that are sideways on this one can tolerate it, but it needs some work. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. And those that are not in favor of it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6. All right. All right. 7. Count best faster. All right, we're gonna go around. Andy, would you like to share with us your opinions on that?
So the special review process, as I understand it, is a planning commission hearing, neighborhood meetings, there are notice periods, and then another notice period, document submission deadline, county hearing, county commissioners hearing and approval. That takes about how long normally? 9 months?
Anywhere between 6 and 9 months,
Okay.
depending upon the merits of the application.
And in addition to the requirements in the draft you sent, there are, as you said, a number of other studies that are required.
Yeah, basically, you have to
Wildlife,
show that you
traffic.
comply with the requirements of the code.
Okay.
And there's things in there like transportation analysis, things like that, the drainage report, various reports and plans that have to be submitted that are already part of that process.
Okay.
That I didn't want to replicate.
Okay. And so this would add 6 to 9 months approximately to the permit approval process,
At the state.
keeping in mind there's already a 6-month approximate approval process. Just wanting that to be clear. And then, as I read the land use code, oil and gas drilling and production is a use by right in all the zoning districts
Today.
currently.
Today.
And so you would have to change the code to remove that, because a special use permit or application is not required in a use, for a use by right.
Right.
Okay?
That's the intent.
So this move to require a special use permit is a big step. And I don't think it should be taken lightly.
Okay. Next.
I tend to agree with everything that Andy said. I guess, from my perspective, I think what I'd like to see is some kind of varying scale. I'm not sure I want to see special use permit required for every facility, but I think it's probably appropriate in certain situations, and so that's kind of what I was envisioning, and the reason I said I wasn't in favor of it.
Okay. Okay.
In the supplemental review criteria, it asks for mitigation steps have been taken. Is that in feasibility studies, or how do you take steps if you don't know?
I think what that's saying, that if we go through a special review process, one of the criteria that the Board of County Commissioners has to weigh in on when they weigh their decision-making is, did the application demonstrate that they've gone through the appropriate plans, processes, things to demonstrate that the application is appropriate for that location? That could be made clear. Richard?
I'm troubled by it based on some experience in the zoning world where some things are handled administratively, like by variances and background from departures from design standards and waivers. And not everything has to go through the quasi-governmental elective processes of Planning Commission and Board of Commissioners. So I would worry that this would tend to drive any oil and gas industry and revenue away from this county, which might be desirable to some people. And I would think there ought to be some smaller administrative process for easier or simpler applications, or for somebody coming in to update or put in new equipment or something.
Okay. Doug?
I agree with Richard's comment on on identifying a subset of very small applications, reboring a well. I don't know exactly what they are, but something that's small that may not need a full special review. That said, I agree that the majority of new applications for a new site, for instance, should be special review. I think the reason is because we're asking people to come in and do inventories of resources, and we're judging how they've handled those inventories. And we're asking people to do, to comply with guidelines, which are not necessarily mandatory. And both of those things take judgment, and that kind of judgment is what I think is appropriate for a discretionary process in a special review. That's why I think most cases should be.
Okay. Mary?
Yeah, I agree with Doug on that most should, especially if we're looking at an administrative process being a possibility with the new info that's been released by the state. I feel like it just opens up too much liability to try and take on applications that are within at least that 2,000 feet and not have it go through that process.
Yeah.
I really don't have any additional comments to make, other than glad to see the difference between the two alternatives that we have discussed. That the first alternative, which really wasn't even an alternative, has been dropped. That's what I'm happy with, but I do agree if there is an opportunity for a simplified process for some, that can be investigated, but there needs to be firm qualifiers on that.
Adrian.
I would agree with the special review process. I think it seems to be more in line with the Senate bill that was passed to individually consider each application. And then I also agree with the vague wording on the reasonable and necessary mitigation steps. I think that is very open to interpretation.
Sherry?
Just clarify something for me, first of all, Matt. Under the 4.5, it says that the planning commission director may require a neighborhood meeting. It doesn't specifically say that a neighborhood meeting is, or some type of neighborhood notice is required. So unless I'm misunderstanding that, I think that the special review process is the way to go. But I have two concerns with that. I do not see that there is enough opportunity for public input and public involvement. And I think there needs to be, with notice for the public and opportunity for the public to participate at two different intervals. One, during the pre-application process, or when the applicant first has the opportunity to talk to the public and say, this is what we'd like to do, whatever, and then at the end to have, for the public to have their opportunity before the BOCC or Planning Commission. The other thing is the minor review process right now under 4.5 says that the planning director, and although the county does not have a planning director, we have a community development director. It doesn't say that, so that's a little unclear. But it gives the planning director the ability to decide when something is minor and when something isn't. I'd like to have that clarified because I don't think that's a clear enough standard. That, and then the other thing is, with the way that we're relying on the current special review process in the county code, it's not specific enough to oil and gas regulations or oil and gas operations. And I think it needs a lot of tweaking to make it more specific. And it's just generally.
Wow. How to follow that anyway? No, just kidding, Sherry. But I do agree with Richard and with Andy. I think that there does need to be an administrative process for a variety of reasons. We're taking the time and effort to write regulations and hopefully meaningful and concise and detailed regulations, and that should make it fairly straightforward for a planning director or Leslie to make a judgment on whether or not a permit coming forward fits in box A or B. Does it need the full Monty, or do we go with the administrative process and review? So I do agree with you guys on that one. On the other question, which was highlighted here, I believe that the county permitting process should follow the state. And the reason for that is I believe that the state, that we will lean on a number of areas, particularly in the health and environmental aspects from the state to guide the permitting process, and rather than the county expend a bunch of time and energy on preparing for a permit that may get significantly changed or rejected by the state, feels like a bit of a wasted effort.
Okay.
My 2 cents.
Kristen?
So I agree a lot with what Andy said, what Richard has said, and what Doug has said. My experience tells me that when things get handled administratively, there are times when if things are not very clear and very specific, they can get kind of muddled, or applicants can get misinformation. And so we'd want to make sure, I think an administrative process is a very good thing to have. I think it puts a lot, I think the 6 to 9 months, as Andy said, is a big deal, along with all of the other stuff that has to be done. But if we can be very clear about what's required with the studies and very clear with that administrative process, I think that can handle a lot of things in the special review would that just be needed in more exceptional cases. So just make the administrative process more robust.
Yeah, I would agree that there should still be a two-tiered process. And I've brought it up before, but I'll bring it up again. All drilling in Larimer County is not created equal. And there is the Wellington oil field where I work, and it is a closed basin, and it's produced for water. But it's subject to oil and gas regulations because of its nature. There is 2% oil in the water that they have to filter. And so those operations themselves, which could considerably be a public source of water in the future, would be subject to all of this. And now we have this special review plan of all these things to where the value of the product that they're bringing out is not going to be on par with oil, gas, and hydrocarbons. But it is a viable field. Like, that water's being used to augment irrigation wells and those sorts of things. And so when we're trying to force that type of production into the same box as a multi-well pad in the south part of the county, you know, you start trying to put round pegs into square holes. And so I would like to see like some consideration for operations like that are unique to our county be considered for their uniqueness in a way that still allows those operators to reasonably operate. Because I do know that they have potential future plans to drill more to produce the water, but again, will be subject to this because of the nature of their basin.
Last is always hardest, right? Everybody said everything. Let's see. I was also concerned about the time frame for the special use process, just knowing that they've already gone through a COGCC process, if that's the way you go. So having and I know we took away the 2,000-foot buffer, any kind of a set level, but if there could be 2 tracks would be great. If they've met all the criteria, all the environmental, you know, if they can be specific enough in in an administrative process, it could really cut down on processing time. And then perhaps if it doesn't meet the requirements or is in a sensitive area or something like that, then for sure needs to go to the special review process.
Very good. Thank you, everybody. That was good. Moving along.
Just as a discussion topic, what would people think about, what would the group think about requiring a special use review if it was less than the state specified setback, but administrative review if it were greater than the state specified setback?
That's where we were at the last meeting, and we couldn't come down.
We were trying to set our own setback. I'm saying default to the state setback.
Most of those setbacks came out of the state. The 1,000-foot was their buffer, the 350.
It's not their setback. So the county doesn't have to put the study into determining what a safe setback is. You accept the state.
Right.
Because a really detrimental thing might be if we go through a special review process 9 months and it goes to the state and they say, well, that doesn't meet our setback. So denied. So
that's a matter of when we go
going back to a
procedurally
two-tiered,
which way.
so I'm bringing up again a 2-tiered process to eliminate the delay and the extra work for everyone, requiring a USR for everything. Worst case scenario in an application that wouldn't be approved at the state. But use the state setback and require a USR if it's inside that.
Okay.
And administrative approval outside that.
Okay. Well, I don't want to run too far
Okay.
down the weeds
Just
on this, so.
Just a thought.
Richard, one last comment?
I understood that the time sequence approval between state and county was a separate discussion, so forgive me. I wonder whether, in light of the 6 to 9 month estimate, whether there is a way to piggyback on the state's process so that if, for example, an application gets fully approved at the state level, whether that would somehow expedite or shorten the review at the county level as a way to kind of help the industry a little. I don't know if that's administratively, environmentally.
Well, I think we'll take this back and we'll study.
If I could comment on that, the state, COGCC prefers that both applications be processed in parallel. And currently, they will not approve a drilling permit that has not been approved by the county. So that's their take. We could take a different stance on it, but it seems counterproductive. So the state's guidance document that is on their website asks that, or says the state prefers the county process and the state process to proceed at the same time, but they won't approve a permit unless and until the county does.
Right, so running concurrent review is a positive thing. I mean, that's what the State Division of Mining, Reclamation, and Safety does.
And we can investigate those things and we'll look into them as we move forward with this and take it. So we've got what we need, I think, from this conversation. All right, moving on. I'm just gonna skip on to 17.3. On to 17.3, and this is the heart of all the things that we've discussed for the last couple of months. Let's start with it as the section in its entirety, and if there's something that we have to break out, we'll break it out. But in its entirety, section 17.3, which talks about these should be standards for all oil and gas operations, or they demonstrate that they don't need to do them. Let's do a pulse check here and see who thinks 17.3 is on the right direction. So everybody show a thumbs up that thinks we're going down the right direction with that section. Show your hands now. 1. Okay. Those who think that they could live with it, but it needs some work. Okay, that's everybody but Adrian. Are you going to go that way or down? Feel free to voice your opinion. Okay, and those that think that we're going in the total wrong direction. All right. Let's start on our right side. Angela, you said last time it's bad going last, so you get to go first.
That's exciting. Okay. I was just concerned about actually just the extent of information in here that could change based on state information often, and sometimes I think a little bit more vague language. I mean, I like specific, just like I just said last time, I like, you can do it administrative if you've been clear enough, but I think if you're too clear, you don't leave yourself room for the state to change their mind about regulation levels and things, or like lists of chemicals that could change at any time, or they'll always coming up with something new, like, oh, these are the only ones you're regulating. Well, we'll come up with a new one or something that can get through the radar. So, yeah, I would just go less specific.
If we're looking at all of them, I don't want to go into detail on a ton. I would agree with Angela in looking at like the chemicals not to be used in hydraulic fracturing. I thought our authority that was granted was not downhole, which those would be considered downhole activities. So Frank, I would defer to you on whether or not that falls under the authority that the county was granted.
Well, we can look at that. I mean, this is one of those conversations that I don't have the exact answer on what we're gonna have total authority over. The downhole stuff we don't, but to the extent it affects the soil or it affects, there's spills or I don't think we can regulate the casings of the things, or how deep they go or whatever else, but to the extent they're affecting groundwater, I think you have an argument that regulating groundwater that's gonna feed into a surface stream is to some extent a land use regulation.
So if some, as I read some of the other regulations that are out there floating around, part of the reason was to regulate those wasn't to affect downhole information. It was, their storage requirements and potential for surface spills, contamination of groundwater and soil and surface water. But it also had to do that with, when you deal with the flowbacks off the fracturing, those chemicals are coming back out, and if they're not put into a closed loop system, to where it's not being recaptured, then those things are potentially getting emitted, and that's part of some of the study stuff that comes out of it, that's being emitted into the air and affects air quality and some of those things. And so I think that's where some of the other jurisdictions, as I read them, were going with that information, was those things we know have a direct impact on air quality, water quality, health, and so we're restricting those, find other better alternatives to do.
Okay, yeah, and maybe if there's a way, you know, to phrase it that that's the intent with it,
Yeah.
I would feel more comfortable with that. In K3, it talks about produced water being transported by pipeline. I bring it back to the Wellington field on that one. It's not currently transported by pipeline, like it is to some extent, but otherwise it's transported out of a tank at this point. So like I said, there are still some oil fields that are produced for different reasons that would still follow under those regs.
Okay.
And then I didn't know, does Lamar County currently have wastewater injection wells?
Not
No.
that I'm aware of. Tom, do you know of any that are out there?
I thought I saw one. There's one or two out. I don't know if they're active or if they were just permitted.
Okay, because L4 would,
Non-commercially, just for that operation.
L4 would put a complete ban on that as well. And I don't know if that would be the same for the Wellington field again, where they do store some of that produced water underground. So, just wanted, like I said, not wanting those provisions to completely eliminate that operation.
Okay. Kristen?
That's kind of funny. You think when you're going third, you'll have lots of new things to add, but they pretty much took the thoughts that I had in terms of some of the specificity and just kind of the overall extent of the whole thing.
Let's see. I did have a couple of questions. One was on, in subsection E, there's a discussion about on-site supervision. I don't think that there exists any, or part of an organization that would be this on-site supervision. And then obviously that has a direct impact on manpower in the county, et cetera, et cetera. And when I looked at the budget for next year, there wasn't a line item for oil and gas department oversight, inspectors, et cetera, et cetera. So just as an aside, two things have got to get, this has got to get married up with that budget that's currently out there. And so if we are calling on-site supervision, who is it, where does it come from, and why is it necessary? If we can be clear about that, I think it'd be helpful to me. That was the first thing. Then in section I around access, we got really specific about, which I think is great, about what that lease road to county road connection looks like. And my question is, doesn't that exist already for the industrial world, you know, gravel mining, blah, 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 blah? And why are we rewriting that in this document? Should we not reference an existing regulation? Or does that existing regulation need more meat, more beef?
Yeah, the simple answer is, picture it as a house. I own a piece of property, a 35-acre property, and I build a house on it, and I build my driveway to my house. that driveway is regulated by nobody. I get to build it to what standard I want to. If I
Correct.
build it at such a shoddy standard, the fire department can't drive up it. That's the case. So the roads, the surface roads that are crossing farmers' fields and whatnot as they leave the county road system have no road standard for them. And so we're saying that with oil and gas operations, because of the potential of risk of injury and activity going on at the sites, need for emergency response, the type of hauling that's occurring in and out during the construction activities, that they need to be designed to a standard. They just aren't just somebody carving a road across somebody's land, one lane wide.
My
with no
point was
standards.
more, doesn't that standard already exist in the code? So
The
the
standard
mining,
exists in the urban, or in the rural road standards for Laramie County, but it doesn't apply for everything that goes off-road. So if you grant me an easement, it doesn't apply to it. And what we're saying is that if it's an easement access road for oil and gas, it should apply for that.
okay.
And
fair-
so we defined that standard.
All right, fair enough. And I don't have a problem with it being defined. I just assumed incorrectly that it's something already existed. Why rewrite if it exists?
And we were making all the right pointers to it.
Well,
Um,
and this goes back to what I was trying to say, is should it be in that other part of the code and referenced from here? That's
We'd have
kind
to
of what
look at
I
our
was
rural
thinking.
area road standards.
Right, so all the road
The
standards are in
thing
one place.
is, all of our road standards apply to publicly dedicated road rights-of-ways. They
Yeah,
don't apply
I
to
know.
anything else unless we assign it specifically to that through a process, and that's why we put it in here.
Okay. I had, sort of a big circle around the chemicals, around hydraulic fracturing. I think you're gonna get into some problems with designation of flowback fluids, which are not, which are considered produced fluids at that point. And that designation is significantly different than the raw chemicals that you've listed on here. I think that needs a lot more thought, to be really honest with you. And by calling out, there's lots of things on here that absolutely shouldn't be used in the industry. There's no question about that. But there are other things that, xylene is a good example. Heck, diesel fuel is a good example of things that might be used in stimulation treatments, whether we use them today or not in the basin is one thing, whether they get used in the future is another. So anyway, I'd look at that list. On the subsection N, well plugging and abandonment, A, B, and D, I think are all called out by the COGCC. I don't think you need to rehash that unless people don't feel like that really needs to, it needs to be emphasized. Let's see. I had a question here about water disposal. I'm trying to refresh my memory as to. P. It didn't seem to jive with water disposal. Burning of debris, trash, or flammable materials not allowed under waste disposal. Sorry, my bad. I'm with you. Okay. The section around flow lines, transfer lines, and gathering lines. Number 3, around coordinates of all flow lines, gathering lines, and transfer lines shall be provided. Is that not a state mandate now, and isn't that a flow-through product that comes to the county? And maybe it's a question if it just needs to be, then the county absolutely should have that info. I'm assuming I believe the state is already gathering that.
Yeah, if the state gathers it, then we would try to implement the same thing as them, or at least have them share that data with us so that we could use it during local review processes to make sure that we're identifying those locations.
And
My understanding is those regs are being revised at the moment based on recent activities, so.
Yeah, I think it was on the news tonight, but, and then, the temporary water lines, you know, the word shall is pretty hard and fast there. Unless technically infeasible. What is, you know, we've captured in a number of different line items, technically or economically infeasible. What is that? You know, what bucket defines technically or economically untenable or infeasible?
Okay.
Because what might be infeasible for me may not be for you. So, and I'm not saying you,
And-
but,
and
you
in
know,
a-
one entity or another.
Yeah, and we'll
That's
take a
all.
look at those and identify them. And typically, when you have a special review process, that leaves the door open for an applicant to create options. To say, you know what, I can't afford to do that technology, but I can do this equal to or better than technology, and then the board gets to sway in and
Right.
make decision on that.
Which comes to another thing that
Yeah,
under,
we gotta keep moving, so.
yeah, there really is one more, and it's important because we're calling out a specific, you know, apply green frac methods. What is that? And if the county, and it goes back to this who has primacy, royalty owner or surface right owner. If the county gets in the business of picking winners, you're gonna get in a pickle, because you're gonna be you could be affecting the economics or the financial viability of a project. That may not be something you wanna get in the
Okay.
middle of.
Gotcha. Okay, try to keep your comments down to 2 or 3 things that we need that would help strengthen this, not a reiteration of all your comments. You could send me your comments and I'll document them as best I can.
I
And you
agree
can
with a
say
lot
ditto,
of what you
too.
had to say, especially with regard to the vagueness of feasible and infeasible, practical, impractical. There's too much leeway there. I know that we're tracking some of the state language, but when you leave the staff in a position to make those decisions, it leads to inconsistency between applications. So really, all of the vague language. On B4, I know we're going to discuss this in another section, but flaring, I really think that flaring should be limited to emergency releases only. With regard to, hang on here. Best management practices, that again has not been defined by whose standards. And under access, under the roads, I really do think the county needs to identify or discuss in some way the impact of operation on GID taxed roads. You need to have some kind of notice to the landowners and the GID, and there needs to be some way for recovery by those taxpayers who self-tax for the roads that would get used. With regard to the list under chemical handling, it makes me uncomfortable that it's an inclusive list, and I think there needs to be some opportunity for the county to reserve the right to add to that list. And then technically, it's an economic, okay, sorry, hang on here. Under financial assurance, I think we need to have a long discussion about the financial assurance in addition to what the state requires, and be a lot more specific, and we can talk about that a little bit later. Under R2, do we define storm events, rain, snow, wind, dust, what's a storm event? So that's just real quick. And some of the language is a little bit awkward, so it's not clear what the intent is. That's all.
Okay, moving on, Adrian.
Yeah, I would echo your kind of same concerns about the leeway that the statement application. That the applicant demonstrates that it is economically infeasible and practical to utilize such a system. Seems like those are all placed in spots or with regulations that would certainly be financially would be financial stressors, I would assume, to implement some of those things, and always economically infeasible. So I think, being more specific about what that means and avoiding the leeway that those statements allow for. My other question was just about the reporting of spills, and I think in section C and D, leaks and spills, about the 24-hour reporting rule, or any verified leaks shall be repaired within 72. I don't know, is that a industry standard? Where did you come up with that number? And why would certain leaks not require reporting before that if it was a dangerous chemical?
All right, we'll look into those things and
Okay.
come up with some choices on those,
Yeah, and I think we'll try and work on clarifying that leaks mainly refer to things that go to the air, and spills are liquids.
Right.
Sure.
So I think we've maybe mixed those up a little bit here, and we'll try and clarify that.
I'm looking at 17.3 under D. I didn't know if there needed to be, were you finished?
Yeah.
Okay. Calls, notification placed to the planning department, just in case you get calls from the citizens, then you're aware as well. On the noise standards, are those from the current county code, or are those from CRS?
COGCC.
Okay, all right. I know agriculture, I think theirs is higher, but that's okay. Other than that, on P, the waste disposal, I understand not disposing of waste on site, but I think that it's important to allow storage of waste on site until it can be removed by a third-party hauler or transferred somewhere. And then other than that, I have no other comments.
Okay, Mary?
I'm going to lead with my disclaimer that I did not have enough time to go through this. So, that said, you'll be getting an email most likely with my afterthoughts, which you always do. So, first thing, my biggest concern is probably under air quality. There are so many statements that say economically infeasible or impractical. You guys took the time to do these public surveys and open houses, and it's a recurrent thing that people put air quality as a top priority. And these are well-informed people that know the state already does this, and they want to see the county do more. So I feel like we have to take some of these items and make them requirements for what the citizens are asking for. I'll just point out number 4, closed loop pitless drilling. I read it was Prima Energy did an analysis on the cost, and it shows that closed loop containment systems were more economically feasible than having pits. So those, I feel like we need to look at those things and just make them a requirement if that's reasonable. The 90-day loophole is a concern for a lot of people. If we could look at that and see if that's something the county can address, emissions during the first 90 days of operations, and require monitoring of that. Leak detection and repair has been shown to be this is letter C, very effective at reducing emissions. So I would like to see something stronger in place than just semi-annual done by the operator. Perhaps a added statement that the county reserves the right to do independent third-party testing with a maximum fee to the operator for that testing at certain times. The noise, I did have a concern about that. I don't know a ton about industrial noise and what that type of impact that would have on residents. But these are complaints that are ongoing with COGCC. They get noise complaints, certainly past the 350-foot mark, that people are complaining about noise. So I don't know if this is strong enough, and just something to look at. Dust, also a concern, is the 300 feet distance long enough for windy days? We have a lot of windy days here in the Front Range, so I just want that looked at to see if that's adequate.
Last couple?
Yep, I'm going. Oh, reuse. So I'd like to see, and maybe this isn't done, but if it's recycled, is it only reused for fracking, hydraulic fracturing? And can we also exclude reuse for agriculture, irrigation?
Yeah.
I'll email you on the rest.
Thanks. Doug?
Largely supportive. I think, for instance, under air quality, I'd make a few comments. I think one of the things we talked about early on is the county should add value and protection above and beyond the state. And I think in this section, you sort of managed to do that. You know, items 1, 2, and 3, restate state and federal air quality standards that apply. And as Mary said, then 4, 5, 6, and 7 are some specific applications. I think that adds value and an expectation. Also, I think there's a possibility that, if we have inspectors in the field that are evaluating some of these things, to the extent that our regulations are similar to the state, and our county inspectors develop ongoing relationships with state inspectors, we can have more of a, we can be more efficient. And the last thing I'd say, I agree with Mary in terms of drop as many of the economically and feasible or practical as you can, but you have to have some. And for those ones that you have, I think that's one of the reasons why we're calling for a special review, because that, again, requires judgment and a decision on whether it meets this.
Okay, Richard?
Number one, maybe there needs to be a statement that wherever our regulations are less strict than those of the state, that the state's regs control some way to deal with conflict and ambiguity between our regs and theirs. A comment I got from a fellow ESAB member relates to 17.3B7 about air quality action day advisories. It is suggested that the applicant include a description of their plan for dealing with air quality action day advisories addressing these things, these A through F, or alternatively that they have to document their compliance on each air quality action day. That seems kind of cumbersome. And then thirdly, at D, spills and releases, not later than 24 hours. I remember at the Maryland Department of the Environment when we had tank spills, the owner-operator had to report them within like 2 or 4 hours.
Volume dependent.
Yeah, it was pretty minimal though. But so it strikes me that 24 hours, maybe I don't know enough about how hard it is to detect spills, but it seems like 24 hours is pretty long, and that at least for the health department of the county, it could be much shorter, like 8 or 12 hours. Because this is
Our preference would be that it be immediate. And so when you read that, it says that there be an immediate response. And basically it is that it go no more than 24 hours. Because we had a spill up north Fort Collins that wasn't reported immediately. And what we're trying to do is make sure that emergency response is put on site, things like that immediately, and maybe that it gets happening. But, if nobody's manning the site and they show up, it's not to say, we'd hope that they do that within an immediate measure unless they have to do something otherwise.
I mean, that's a good point. I'd probably tighten the no later than up to 8 or 12 hours. Thank you.
On air quality for the Quality Action Day advisories. I think some of those need to be looked at closer because they can become a safety issue by reducing personnel that's on site during certain operations. I agree with some of the duplicity of some of the regulations that are already in place for COGCC that have already been talked about. As far as spills and releases, I saw somewhere else in the code that there is already code for that through a dispatch services. I don't remember what number it was. And then also the thresholds and the type of products, whether it's EMP exempt or refined product that's being reported. The noise needs to be defined further, whether it's, at the very end, it says, for a reasonable period of time for completion of a project. Well, due to continuous operations, this could go on for years and years. So that needs to be looked at closer per the phase of either production drilling. Let's see what else I had. I'm just gonna comment, the reuse for ag, I think is already regulated in being able to release water. So that one, I don't think that we can say that it can't be used for certain things. There's already regulations in place for that. I think everything else was pretty much gone over already, so I'll stop with that.
I didn't have a lot to add, based on the comments everybody else had. I think the one question I had, was in section U1, financial assurance, that the applicant has to demonstrate financial capability to reclaim all disturbed areas, during each phase of site development. I think I want some clarification on what's required that they demonstrate that financial capability. I don't know the specifics, but I know that the state requires posting of a bond for reclamation. And so is this an additional surety or bond above and beyond what's required at the state? Or is this just requiring that in the application they show they've complied with the state standards in posting the bond? So I guess some clarification about that.
Yep.
In general, I find these regulations surprisingly realistic and workable.
You sound so surprised.
Andy, you're on tape for saying that.
I'll give a quick run through on the highlights, and then I'd like to send you some comments. The air quality action days, on some days of operations, you can't safely or realistically shut down. Standby charges could be hundreds of thousands of dollars a day, or you put the hole at risk if you're drilling. So at other times, it's easy to comply with, and the operator would want to comply with it. So other times, the operator can't comply realistically. The leak section on what's a verified leak, just would like a little clarification on that. Tom was getting at that, I think. Well, liquids unloading, E1, I'm not certain I understand the language there, but that can be wordsmithed. On access, I think if on I1C, if you specify that there should be no fugitive dust, that might get the point, that might accomplish what you want to protect the residents, rather than saying you must use mag chloride, which I happen to think is a pretty nasty chemical. So it's not necessary. If the road is gravelled and compacted properly, you won't have dust. But if you do, make the operator do something, rather than just make him use mag chloride, which is counterproductive.
We got that. I don't know how that.
The rest of that is actually pretty workable. I would like to say, instead of pavement, possibly if it's the middle of winter and you can't get asphalt pavement, compacted recycled concrete or recycled asphalt works as well as pavement in most cases. The chemical list, I only see one chemical on here that's used fairly commonly, and I'd just like time to review that. On recycle and reuse, I think in general, you don't want the operator to recycle because not only is it not economically feasible here, but you're going to have to store some fluids and work with them on site for a long period of time. There's no place to go with recycled fluids. You can't use them in fracturing fluid around here. Fresh water is readily available and disposal wells are readily available. So the best protection for the county residents would be to haul, flow back, and produce waters off-site to a disposal well in another county, and then it's gone, and chance of spills is lessened, and there's really nothing to do with recycled water currently. So you would be better served by eliminating that requirement. In L4, clarify that. Do you not want commercial water injection wells in the county? There are none currently. You could say you don't want any, but you can't say that you don't want to dispose of it via an injection well, because you really do. That's the safest and best method to dispose of it currently. On S, flow lines, transfer lines, currently the multi-well pads don't have any off-site lines. But, this really wouldn't apply to a permit that you're likely to see. But I'm curious how pipelines are regulated in the county, because the gathering lines, oil and gas that go off the pad, they're not necessarily subject to this because they're not coming in under they're not owned by the operator, so they don't come in under an oil and gas well permit. They wouldn't really be subject to this, but I don't know how pipelines are regulated. You may want to put some of this language in your pipeline regulations, because it's nice to put it in here, but there's nothing off location essentially. Custody transfer happens on the pad, and a gathering company takes it, and they have to apply for their own permits. Temporary water lines are used invariably all the time, 100% of the time on a large pad, but really are not feasible on a small pad, or if someone wants to drill one well, like in the Wellington field. It's feasible to truck water in, and they want to do that. They really can't afford, and it doesn't make any sense to put a temporary water line in. So the technically or economically feasible actually protects someone that wants to come in and drill one single well. It does happen. Those are the high points.
Thanks, everyone. Moving on. We gotta get to,
I'm going to suggest, in the interest of time, that we look at the last page, basically 17.5 through 17.10, as a batch, and then we can call out specific comments that you have about any of those, since it's a relatively short section.
okay, so 17.5, which is application requirements. 6 is appeals, 7 enforcement. We'll look at all those collectively. They're really more procedural type things than anything else. If you're gonna submit an application, these are the types of things that go on, or how appeals are filed to standards and whatnot. So if everybody thinks that we're going in the right direction with those items, please show a thumbs up. Okay, I got 5. Those that think that it's going in an okay direction but needs some work. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Those don't like it at all. Okay. Let's be quick. Let's say we're gonna, a couple of seconds each, because we're gonna give you each 2 minutes to talk about what you think about going on for the future. So we've got to account for the last half hour, and then we had a little bit of add-on stuff that we wanted to do before we wrap this up. So just super quick, can we go through and hear your highlights on those? I'm going to come back over here. I went twice there. You get to go now.
I actually think they're going in the right direction, so no comments.
Okay.
This is on 17.5. 17. The only concern I had on that was, again, the requirement of a surface use agreement in the case of a non-consenting service owner.
Okay.
Sometimes it's not feasible to get them, and sometimes surface owners are willing to sign an intent to sign, but surface use agreements can take a lot of negotiation, as I think you can attest, and sometimes surface owners will wait until the permit is approved to finalize that surface use agreement.
Okay. Thanks.
I agree with the surface use agreement comment. Also, just some concerns about enforcement and inspection to some extent that was brought up earlier in terms of making sure that we have the teeth behind what's in the regulation in terms of boots on the ground and the best way to maximize those resources.
Wynn?
Share Kristen's thoughts. Those were mine.
Sherry?
On 17.5A, where it says when relevant, if we could clarify that so that we can make sure that the county has the right to determine the relevancy. And then the lists, A through O, is that excluding the lists that were on this packet from last month, under section 5? Because this list is a whole lot longer than the list that's showing in the proposed. So if we could incorporate this list back into here, because what's here excludes any type of protection of environmental resources or the environment. So
Well,
this
Item A,
includes that.
17.5A says, in addition to the submittal requirements of the land use code, which covers those environmental features,
All of it?
which are those other things. So
Okay.
we weren't replicating it. That
Thank
was the point. Thank you. Mhm. Adrian? Dan?
No comment other than,
Well, maybe I'll think about that. This is twice tonight, right? No.
17.5A, C and K appear to be the same thing. That's the only thing.
Yep, thanks. Mary?
My only comment, if environmental stuff is already covered previously, would be under 17.7, just adding maybe a statement, and maybe this will be refined down the road, but the county reserves the right to impose practical fees for these violations.
Okay. Doug?
No comments.
Richard?
In 17.9B, the reclamation would also be pursuant to financial assurances provided, not just the reclamation plan. In 17.8, at A and B, since it's really vague and minimal, I like to recommend a standard of for A, of something about the administrative costs of review, and so that it becomes reasonable and has a nexus with what's being reviewed. And in B, if you're really heading toward narrowing it to capital transportation impact fees, I assume there are already standards for that connected with road improvements and road widening, so that one should be an easier lift. Okay, thank you.
In addition to the reclamation plan, I think stormwater and drainage should be incorporated for long-term through the production phase. And then to add to the reclamation, more clarification, I don't know if you're going down the road, if there's additional requirements for mining, if that's what you're asking for, or what, if it's above and beyond what the state is asking for.
Gotcha.
Just a couple of quick comments. I think one of the areas I think we probably need to tighten up the language is 17.5 application requirements, specifically that the application shall also include, when relevant, the following. And I think there's some room for interpretation both ways about when is something relevant. Going back to the surface use agreement example, I think you can interpret it the way the language is written, that a surface use agreement is required as part of the application. But there's also the interpretation is it only required when it's relevant, meaning that you just attach it to the application if it exists, but it's not a requirement to be able to apply in general? So I think tightening up that language to maybe show in an application, what are the items that are always required, no matter what, as part of the application? And then in applications, what are the items that you have to include if they exist? And that way there's some clarification about, do you have to have a surface use agreement all the time, or do you just have to include it if it's in place and exists when you apply? I also, kind of going back to that, like to argue, I think I'd like to see in these regulations a requirement that there is a surface use agreement to protect the surface use owners, and maybe it goes to the special review process where you make the showing that you require the surface use agreement unless there are not feasible alternatives to the proposed site, where you can't find owners that would agree to permit the surface use, and it gives some protection to the surface owners.
Okay, good. And
I have nothing to add, subtract, multiply, or divide.
thank you. All right, well, we got exactly half hour, and we're probably gonna go over that by about 10 minutes. But we decided that it would be good to give you guys, we want to talk about options. Did you want to go over the options real quick? And then we're going to give you 2 minutes each to go over your final closing thoughts.
Yeah, I think if we could just spend a few minutes on the backside of the agenda where we have put forward some different schedules about how to move forward. And we thought, let's have the conversation about where we were with the draft outline of regulations and then do this, so we had a better sense of what might come next. So what we have are a couple different possibilities. One is a schedule where we take a bit more time and we spend more time working on the draft. This was presuming maybe we were off track and had a lot more work to do, that we might not have a new draft until, say, December or January. I think maybe given what we're hearing tonight is a thought that we could move a little bit faster than that. So something more like the second option. But I'll just go through these really quickly. So the first option basically, as you see here, takes us through a series of steps, including some engagement open houses with the public, probably a check back with your group again at some point. And then basically all the way to a June or July adoption, as you can see in all the bullet points there. The second schedule does a lot of those same things, but is a little bit faster and takes us through to an adoption in about February or March. A third option is we just put these on the back burner and we wait till the state's done with its rulemaking. We just thought we'd put that out there and see what your thoughts were. We've heard a lot about a fourth option from members of the community, which is basically put a moratorium in place and don't do anything until the states impose its regulations and you have regulations in place. We've asked the commissioners that question previously and they've not been interested in that, so I didn't put that here, but I want you to know that we know that that's an option that the community's talked about a fair amount. So we wanted to share these with you. I think if we could do a similar kind of thumbs up on a sense of moving a little bit more slowly, number one, or moving a bit more quickly, number two, or something else, maybe we can start there and then take your comments on thoughts on process going forward, and we can just do this fairly quickly. So who here thinks, with just a quick thumbs up vote, that you prefer something more like option one? So 1, 2, 3, 4 or so. Did I get everybody? 4 or 5? Okay. Who here prefers something more like option 2? So a few more. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 or so, if we're counting everybody right. So a little bit more in favor of moving a bit more quickly. Anybody thinking something else that's either option 3 or not on the page? Yes.
I assume that regardless, after the state adopts their regs, or the most relevant ones to us, that the commissioners and you will revisit any regs that the county adopts in the short term and tweak them or amend them or modify them or repeal them. And that, I think, should be at least an assumption or a premise at the bottom of the page.
Yeah, it actually is an italic note here after the first option. I should have pointed that out. But yes, we always have the opportunity to amend a regulation, and we can certainly keep tabs on what happens with the state rulemaking. And if there's a section where we feel like we just didn't get it quite right, or we went too little or too far and we need to fix it, we could have the option to come back and take a look at that at the end of next year or the year after that or sometime soon.
And that could be true of option 2 as well.
Yes.
Yeah, I think I'd just like to
Yes.
add, I think I'd like either option 1 or option 2. If we choose either of those, I'd like the option for the task force to reconvene once the state has adopted their regulations. And it may be
Okay.
a short meeting where we don't have to do much. It may mean that we've got a lot of additional work to do, but I think that is an option that should be out there. If we choose to adopt rules before the state's done, I think there should be option that we reconvene and kind of address what that means for Larimer County.
Okay, yes.
Just a quick question for you. In terms of presenting what the task force has put together, our charter requires a 2/3 majority vote for it to be presented to the county commissioners. And so I just didn't know how we would go about taking that vote. Like, we would get a draft and then there would be kind of a private vote submitted to you, or we would reconvene again before it's put in front of the commissioners, or what your plan there was.
Yeah, so the way that we've been treating that is kind of more in pieces. So we've been taking notes, of course, as we've taken a poll or taken a vote along the way. We've been doing that, and we'll report to the commissioners that on each of these parts and pieces, here's how the task force gave us feedback. Now, if we do need to reconvene and take a vote on the final set of regulations, that's something we could look at, and depending on the schedule that we're at, we could do that too. I think we've heard from the commissioners that they are interested in knowing not only how the task force as a whole voted on the whole thing or parts of the regulations, but also what other opinions came with that. So I think, we won't do a separate minority report, but we'll just make sure we report out to them, where the task force was as a majority, and then where there were other perspectives on different issues as well. So that's what they've asked us to do. What thoughts do you have, just since we're on this subject and this notion of reconvening the task force? Is there interest in reconvening the task force sooner as we complete the regulations so you can look at them and vote or give input on that? Or would you prefer to reconvene at some point later on? We thought we could reconvene you at the same time that we do something as a rollout for the public. And that could be that we do an open house and a task force on one afternoon or evening, so that there's an opportunity for you all to give some feedback and tell us what you think. And also we can hear from other members of the community or public at that point too. Thoughts on that? Do you want to reconvene sooner?
There's been a lot of suggestions coming from tonight, and there will be a lot of redrafting that you guys are going to have to do. I apologize. I wouldn't mind meeting again toward the end of November to go over what you have come up with. I would volunteer for that.
You're volunteering for a Thanksgiving meeting?
Week before, maybe the week before.
Yeah.
Well, and it could be, depending upon what the direction we get from the commissioners, it could be later or sooner. We're gonna have to look and see how we can fit all this together. I mean, there's a bunch of other things going on in the community, so.
Yeah. So I'll just do a quick pulse check. In general, would you like to reconvene as a final draft comes together? Yes or no? Looks like mostly yes. Okay. All right, good. That's helpful information. Okay, so I don't want to take too much more time on this. I think that gives us the direction we need on where to go from here, so thank you. So Matt, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right. Well, as promised, we suggested that we would close this meeting out. We've got some final closing things, but we would open up the floor to the task members. Each of you are allowed to have 2 minutes of conversation about anything that you want to share with this that we could carry forward. And if you have nothing to say, that's fine. If there's something you want to say, or what can we do better, how can we improve it, what should we include from this point forward, please share that. If there's nothing that you don't want to add, just pass. And I will time it to keep us on schedule. All right? Andy?
I think our charge was to come up with what is the most important thing to keep in mind for Larimer County in this process. Or that, I remember that from the email anyway. I think, first, thank you, all of staff, for the hard work you put in. I think the most important thing to keep in mind going forward, and it's something that we've done a good job of so far, is balance. We have to balance the residents' needs, the mineral owners, the surface owners, the environment, and the oil and gas operators who are trying to make everybody happy in that process. So as we go forward, looking back, we've done a good job of not, for instance, banning oil and gas development and not banning hydraulic fracturing, both of which don't really make any sense, and I'm glad we have kept that balance in mind. I think the health study is another good example of balance. It sort of sets one limit on how bad things could be, but it's not the be-all and the end-all. It needs to be balanced with what it was actually doing and what it actually means. So I think keeping a balance to this process going forward, I think we've done a good job so far, but keeping balance in mind going forward is what would be my main takeaway or recommendation.
Thanks, Andy. Next.
I don't have anything to add other than in commending you guys for coming up with a pretty fair set of regulations, and I know not an easy task in the limited time we have, so thank you guys for working with us and for everybody on the task force and coming and having good discussion as we move through this.
Good. Thank you. Okay.
I appreciate all the very intelligent people that are serving and volunteering their time. I have appreciation for that and being able to hear different viewpoints. I do wish the communication would have been open a little bit more from staff and asked for more help from the task force instead of just being put on the spot to be able to think through some of this a little bit more. But I think the people that you did have come and present was a huge help in understanding regulations that are in place and understanding how the county operates and how these regulations are put together. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Richard.
Thank you for all the hard work of the staff producing this stuff and keeping us moving forward.
Thank you. Doug?
I really appreciated the respectful nature of all of our discussions and being able to speak and being able to listen. I think that's really important. I think there's 3 things for moving forward that I would like to recommend. One is I think the county should participate when appropriate in rulemaking at the Air Quality Control Commission and Oil and Gas Conservation Commission level when they have rulemaking, public rulemaking processes. 2, I think the county has to ensure that it has adequate staff available for on-site inspections and complaint investigations. And 3, and this has already been talked about plenty tonight, that we should revisit our regulations once the state completes theirs.
Okay, thank you. Mary?
Yeah, thank you to everybody, volunteers and staff, appreciate it. My biggest thing and the reason I'm here is health and safety, and I do appreciate, I've learned so much from everybody and the perspectives that you have shared, so I do appreciate that, and I've learned a lot. So my main concern with that is the lack of setbacks with the regulations. I know it's a tricky thing to tackle. We learned that last time, that you just really get nowhere. But I feel it is something that the county should do. They need to set a standard, what they consider safe development. And maybe that comes after the state comes out with theirs, but I would be willing to work with anybody on this, but I feel like it should be a part of our regulations to set a standard and just have some predictability for operators and for residents so they know what to expect. It's a lot of variability if somebody's going into a meeting before the board and they don't know if this is going to happen or not on both sides. So I feel we need that predictability. And again, I'm willing to be a part of that. If there's a subcommittee, I'd be happy to do that. The other concern, and Sherry brought this up, is public notification. I feel it has to be out there. Meetings have to be a part of the process. And whoever is interested or concerned should be able to be involved in the process and learn along the way if they need to. Cost of doing business, I'd ask that that really be looked into between application fees and road impact fees. And then water quality, I think we really need to defer to Thomas Borsch, who was not here tonight. I think he has a lot of input he could offer to really strengthen the water quality and spill concerns that come up with drilling. Thank you.
Thank you.
As the planning commission liaison, I guess what we would be concerned with is making sure, echoing the balanced approach, clear, transparent, defensible regulations, no duplicity with the existing special use permit, which I believe you had mentioned, and this is kind of an overlay to an existing process. Don't want to duplicate what's already required by the COGCC, and any items presented to us are based on facts. And thank you, Matt and Leslie and everybody else from the county that came and members of the Oil and Gas Committee. Thank you for your time.
Adrian.
Yeah, I'd like to thank you guys too for your time and for letting me come and join the last two meetings that you have had. Obviously, I wasn't able to be at those first meetings, so certainly missed some, but did sit through watching all of those meetings. I made it. I mean, my perspective is very singular as a physician in the community. I really don't know and have learned a lot of the details of, what a day in and day out of development in the oil and gas industry. So truly my concern would just be taking a really health protective approach and taking a conservative approach. I counsel obstetrical patients daily, and I have to tell them things like don't eat cold lunch meat when you're pregnant because of a 1 in a million chance of getting listeria. And so in the same vein, if there's any concern from the practices that are happening on the Front Range for our health and environment, I think we should really take a conservative and slow approach that favors the citizens and the wildlife and the environment, unfortunately, over industry. And I certainly appreciate balance, but I do think that human health and human lives are more important than that. So that's where my standpoint would be.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure.
I would like to say that any type of balance includes taking care of the environment, because when we take care of the environment, we take care of every single one of us, from whatever point of view. So with that in mind, protection of our county's open space and natural lands, including wildlife habitat and migration routes, is very important to me, and to the Open Lands Advisory Board, who I am representing. Public notice and participation is imperative, and that the county makes sure that the bonding goes over and above what is required by the state, if that is what is necessary to make sure that the county is always left whole, and that the county is never left in a situation where a well has been abandoned and the county is left with someone who has declared bankruptcy, and then the citizens have to pay for that. I like the special review process, but I do think it needs to be tweaked to be a little bit more oil and gas specific. And then I'd like to thank you, Matt, you, Leslie, Tom, Frank, all the staff people who have worked on this, everybody on the task force, and all of the people in the community who have participated, and all of the people and the commissioners and the planning commission who will be participating on this, because it's a tough one, but I think that we have all through the process kept in mind what you said, Andy. We have kept in balance in mind. And so thank you all, and it's been a real delight to be here and to be able to participate, and I look forward to continuing to do so.
Thanks.
Let's see. So thanks very much to you guys, Leslie, yourself, and Matt. Frank, thanks for being here with a tie every time. That was awesome. Tom, thanks for coming. Appreciate it. I guess sort of for me, fundamentally, there was a kind of there was a sort of a fundamental on what these, our efforts should be focused on, and that should be, what's unique about our county that demands regulations over and beyond what the state has in place or will create through the COGCC, and where there's an absence of a regulation, and whether if it's applicable in our county, we should apply something that's sound and reasonable and what have you. So that's kind of my fundamental overarching sort of what I thought about as we went through this. I hope the county budgets this organization that's going to be these responsible for oversight and what have you. I know other departments will be involved, but there's going to be somebody who's going to be, a department that's going to have to go out and ensure that regs are being followed, inspections are being performed, spot or scheduled. Structure and stability through regulation is always better than ambiguity. So I think the oil and gas operators, and I don't represent them, I think that's always better than ambiguity and lack of clarity. So thank you guys very much. Appreciate everybody around the table here. So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Thanks. Kristen.
So I want to start by commending you for putting together an excellent group of people to take on this task that you've taken on. I have continued to be impressed by the people around the table. I would echo a lot of the comments that Ann made in terms of process and how to fit this in with regulations and processes that are already in place. I would also encourage you, wherever possible, to define your terms well and clearly, and you can probably none of us can ever do that well enough, but make that a goal. And lastly, just want to thank you on behalf of the Rural Land Use Advisory Board for allowing us to participate.
Thank you.
I too want to say thank you to all the staff. As a former state government employee, I know how often your hard work goes overlooked or underappreciated, and I just want you to know how much I appreciate all the meals you put together and all the people and all the time, and that takes a lot of effort internally that doesn't get recognized, so just thank you so much for that. And thank you to everyone on the task force. I too have really appreciated getting to know you, getting to see your perspectives. I think as a lawyer, I get focused on all the legal aspects and sometimes forget or don't put to the forefront the other aspects that everyone else has put forth. And I've really learned a lot about air quality and water quality and impacts to our environment and the things that I don't get to see on a daily basis. So thank you for that. And I also wanted to thank the people who sit in the audience every night who have had conversations with me. And while we think that we have or are on opposing sides, when we really got to talk, our interests are not that different. And so, like Andy was saying, and a lot of others have reiterated, that balance of property rights, the property rights of the mineral owners, the surface owners, and the oil and gas operators, the leasehold owners, their certainty in knowing that what they have purchased and what they own is still viable and still holds value, but also protecting the private property rights of our citizens in the air that they breathe and the wildlife that they love and their open spaces that they love, and I do think that we have come to at least a somewhat reasonable balance on those things. And I think just in terms of moving forward, continuing that balance, you know, not letting one override the other, looking out for everyone, because I feel like that's really important. I feel like certainty moving forward would be beneficial to everyone. A lot of stress is created when we have all of these rules and regulations that aren't definitive. So again, just thank you to everybody, and I've really enjoyed this experience.
Thanks. Angela?
I also would like to say thank you for this amazing experience and this incredible group of people that I've learned so much from in the last several months. Just every week has been an amazing learning experience. And also, I want to thank the county for the amazing transparency and public involvement that you've had in making this regulation change. And just, I don't take it for granted as a planner. I know all the things, okay, you've set up websites and ways to input information for people who are here and people who couldn't make it, and opportunities for the public to add into the conversation, not just the task force. And I really do commend you for that. It was well done. For going forward, again, balance is so important. I would want to make sure that as you finalize the regulations, that they are clear, as many other people have stated, that they are enforceable, and that they are fundable. So, thank you.
Very good. Thank you, everybody. I'm just going to say a quick thing or two. I really appreciate everybody at the table. When this started coming together, there was a lot of issue with who's getting put on the board and whatnot, and that was left with the commissioners to decide. After working with y'all, I don't think that they could select a much better group of people. I think you guys really put some time and energy and thought into this. It's certainly opened my eyes. I've learned a ton here about oil and gas, thanks to some of the professionals here that know what's going on with that. We will continue to work on this. We will refine this information. We will make it better. We'll come up with something that hopefully the commissioners can adopt and everybody can be satisfied with as a balanced approach. Thank you all for that. Thanks to the audience for always coming and being polite and observing the ground rules for these meetings. I appreciate that. I know that's hard to do, to sit there and hold your tongue, but we certainly appreciate letting these fine people do their work. Thank you to Frank and to Leslie and to Tom for supporting me through this whole effort. They give me so much support on this. It's great. Tom, I think you're retired, right? Sort of kind of came back. He doesn't want to admit he's retired. It's kind of like Doug. They keep coming back. Just can't let go, can you? But what a great bunch of people. I really appreciate it. It's been fun working with y'all, and I look forward to re-engaging with you all on other topics and continuing this conversation.
And I'd like to ditto all that, but I also want to make sure that, community development, I mean, Matt deserves a huge applause for this because he's really, he's really carried a lot of the weight on this. But I also don't want to undersell the effort that our partnering departments have put into this, because the health department, natural resources, I mean, a lot of different agencies of the county have been a part of this too. And so it's been a really great partnership. And then, of course, you all are wonderful. It's been said time and time again. I'll just say it again. So thank you so much.